I'm a 21-year-old woman trying to finish my studies while working on the side. This happened to me 3 years ago at one of my previous jobs. I worked at a smaller Domino's for about 2.5 years. This happened about 6 months into me working there. I was 18 at the time, pretty much freshly 18, and was working there to pay my car payment and have a job while I figured out what I wanted to do with my life. I was working a night shift with my boss, assistant manager, and a few others. My shift started at 4 in the afternoon and went until midnight, so I was a closer. About an hour into my shift, a man parked a white truck outside and walked into the building. I was working the front, so I greeted him and asked if he had an order placed already. He said yes and told me his name. His order wasn't ready yet, so I told him that it would be a few minutes. Now, to me, everyone looks tall considering I'm 5 feet 2 inches, but this man was tall. I'd guess around 6 feet 4 inches. He looked older, like late 20s to early 30s, was heavier set, white, and was wearing a Wendy's uniform. Being the typically friendly person I am, I made conversation and asked if he worked at the Wendy's across the street, as I had used to work there. He gave me a smile and said, "Shame. Wish you still worked there for my sake." To me, that was odd, and his tone definitely sounded flirtatious, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. After a bit more small talk, I gave him his pizza and told him to have a nice night. About 30 more minutes went by when the phone rang. I picked it up and answered it. "Thank you for calling Domino's. This is Jordan. How may I help you?" "Oh, the cute redhead that just helped me out." My heart dropped. My suspicions were confirmed about the guy flirting with me. He asked me for my number, and I told him no thank you, and that I wasn't willing to give that information out. I told him to have a good day and hung up. I hoped that would be the end of it. To be sure, I let both my boss and assistant manager know what had happened and that I was uncomfortable. Luckily, they completely understood, my boss making a comment. "Not saying this is a bad thing, but you barely look 16, so he almost sounds like a pedophile." Now, from an outside perspective, he could have just been being friendly. Yes, I understand that. And at that point, I could have been overreacting, you're right, but I was just uncomfortable. Fast forward to about 10 at night. I saw a white truck park outside the building and the same man get out of the truck. I immediately turned to my assistant manager, who pulled me into the back and into the office so he couldn't see me. My boss approached the guy and asked him what he needed, but the guy just kept looking around for me. I could see this because the office had a window that sort of acted like a one-way mirror. I started crying, and my manager hugged me and told me she wasn't going to let anything happen to me. She's a big girl, not heavy, just bigger and more built than I am. My boss spoke to the guy saying, "Look man, she's already rejected you, and I'm not letting you see or talk to her. Get out of my store, because if you can't tell, she's fucking uncomfortable." The guy's face twisted in anger, and he stormed out of the store. He climbed into his truck, backed out of his spot so fast that he spun his tires and squealed off. I let out a sigh of relief, and my boss came to the back to check on me and let me know that I was safe, to take my time and clean myself up, and that I could go home early, because that was a lot to handle. He then went back up front to run the store. My manager and I sat there and talked, her trying to make me laugh a bit while I calmed down. The phone rang in the office, and my manager answered. Later, I found out it was one of our drivers. He called asking what vehicle the guy that was harassing me drove. She told him a white truck, and he said that the guy was driving his truck around the parking lot, circling it, waiting for me to leave. My manager said, "Oh, fuck no." By the time I said, "What?" she was already up, her taser in hand, running out of the office and to the front door. She ran outside and made it go off, giving that typical shocking sound. He left the parking lot and sped off down the street. At this point, I called my dad. He was across the street at the bar. He's not an alcoholic. He just enjoys throwing darts on a Friday night. I told him to come to my work and follow me home because this creepy guy was freaking me out. Pretty quickly, my dad got there, gave me his keys, and told me to drive his car, and he'd drive mine in case the guy knew what car I drove. I drove home with no issues and barely slept that night. For the next month, that guy would park in the parking lot next to my car for hours, waiting for me to leave the store. I never left while he was there. Eventually, he stopped parking and just circled the parking lot and building a few times a day. 3 months later, it finally all stopped. Nothing has happened since. If you're going to take anything from this, just know that even with the very little initial interaction I had with the guy, my gut was right, and he was a scary guy. So, always trust your gut. I have a knife on me at all times now, and I refuse to leave my night job without someone walking me to my car. I don't work there anymore, but that incident still haunts me. This happened to me when I was in middle school. For background, we used to live in a really crappy, old house in a really crappy old neighborhood. Our house had 2 types of fences. In the very back of our backyard was a tall wooden fence, and in the front and sides of the house was a generic white picket fence. The first year we lived there, it was very quiet. We rarely saw any neighbors or heard anything. However, that changed when I started hearing knocking at my window. This went on for a couple of weeks, and every time I told my parents, they didn't believe me. I was very spiritual at the time, and I used to think our house was haunted. It creaked a lot and always had weird noises, which I took as evidence. The knocking got worse over the weeks. I remember thinking that it was coming from the mirror in my room because it was so loud that it seemed like it was coming from right inside my room. I had 2 windows in my room, one above my nightstand and one next to my bed. I want to specify that the knocking only came from the one above my nightstand. The window next to my bed had a large metal box underneath it with loud fans on it. The other window had bushes below it. The knocking grew louder over the next few weeks. At that point, I confided in my younger sister Anna, since my parents didn't believe me. I found out that she had also heard loud knocking from her windows. I told my parents that we both heard the noises. My dad said he had investigated, but didn't find anything. One night, I remember very vividly. I had built a pillow fort in my room with chairs and sheets and was sleeping in it that night. It was late summer and I couldn't sleep, so I watched the Dolan twins on YouTube. I eventually put my phone on my nightstand, rolled over, and tried to fall asleep. That's when the soft tapping on my window started. By this point, I was used to it, but still, I was terrified. I lay still and waited for it to stop, but it didn't. The tapping turned into loud knocks, then soon into pounding at my window. I refused to move. By then, I was crying. I thought the glass was going to shatter from how hard the pounding was. I heard my window shaking as it continued. And as soon as it started, it stopped. The knocking seemed to stop for a while, but this only led to even weirder things happening. I remember looking at the bushes under my window that were strangely shifted. That's when I realized that a person had been doing this, not some ghost. Other strange things happened at the house too. One night, when my family had gotten home pretty late, I heard a phone go off in the large bushes under Anna's window. It was pitch black outside, so I didn't see anyone, but I swear, I heard a phone ping. This happened twice. A couple of nights later, I heard a phone ping under my window while I was in bed. Random rocks and marbles would show up outside. I didn't think much of it at first, but it was weird. Outside, in front of our garage, we found large rocks, like the ones you'd find at a playground. Our house didn't have any like that. Along with them, we would find small marbles. The reason I suspected our neighbor was because he was the only one we ever saw. It was rare to see him, but usually he was just in his yard. If I saw him, or if he caught me looking at him, he would move out of sight behind our larger wooden fence. There was one day when he really scared me and Anna. My dad had left for something, and Anna, my mom, and I were the only ones home. Anna and I were sitting on the back porch swing, which we did often as the sun began to set. We faced towards our white fence, and I had been looking around the yard when I saw him. Our neighbor, at our fence, peering over and watching us. I tried to ignore him, but then he started walking along our white fence. He paced back and forth beside our fence, watching us, without speaking. He did this for a couple of minutes before my mom noticed, I guess through the window. She made us come inside, and she stayed by the glass back door to watch him. He kept pacing. After a while, not speaking or leaving, and showing no signs of stopping, my mom called my grandfather and my dad to come back. Once my grandfather showed up, the neighbor left and went back into his house. After that, we didn't hear much from him. We would occasionally hear knocks or find rocks, but otherwise, he stayed quiet. My fear about a stalker was confirmed after we moved. The family that moved in after us had 2 sons, about the same age as Anna and me. The new residents reported that once, their oldest son accidentally threw something away and went to find it in the garbage outside. The next morning, they found a letter on their front porch, not in the mailbox. If I remember correctly, it read something like, "I saw your son last night, digging through the trash. You should tell him to be more careful. You don't know who is watching." The family moved shortly afterward. I told my parents about this, and apparently, the family had been experiencing similar things to what Anna and I went through when we lived there. As far as I know, nobody lives at that house anymore, and the person who left the notes, knocked, and did all those things was never found or caught. It freaks me out to think about how my parents didn't believe us, only for them to be proven wrong by the next family that moved in. In 1986, when I was about 5, my dad's job moved us from Brooklyn to a bit upstate, and we bought a house in Connecticut. It was quite a change in lifestyle, from a crazy, crowded neighborhood to 3 or 4 acres on a windy road in the woods. My mom especially loved the scenery and the quiet. It should be pointed out that my mom was about 27 or so at the time, and my dad was about 30. All was fine for a while, until my mom grew increasingly uneasy about a man she said she was seeing everywhere she went. When she went to the supermarket, he was there and would smile at her. She took my sister and me to the park one day, and he was sitting on a bench staring at her. There were many more instances, and at some point, my mom mentioned it to my dad, who I think kind of wrote it off at the time. He had never seen the guy and figured it was just a coincidence. The town wasn't terribly big. You were bound to run into people over and over, but my mom was adamant, and it began to get more frequent over the course of about a month or so. I can almost recall her always being on edge when we went places. Finally, after one such incident, she called my dad at work crying and said that she was sure now that he was watching her daily movements. She said she was leaving to pick my sister up from nursery school when she noticed a car through the trees on the road about 50 yards up from our driveway. When she got in her car, the other car pulled out and began to follow her. With increasing worry, she drove to get my sister and went into the school. When she came out, she saw the guy, who she said appeared to be her age, with sunglasses on, standing by his car looking at her. She had had enough at this point, and her Brooklyn kicked in. She started yelling all manner of shit at the guy, who promptly jumped in his car and sped off. This was enough for my dad now, who came home from work and promptly called the police. I remember they came to the house and spoke to my parents in the other room. Well, as luck would have it, the police knew exactly who the guy was, as he had been on their radar for a similar incident a few years before with another woman. However, they described him as sort of simple-minded and harmless, and had never threatened anyone or done anything violent. He was just a bit of a weirdo who couldn't take the hint. In what was a stunning display of small-town police ineptitude and sort of stupidity on the part of my father to allow it, the cops said they would speak to the guy and his parents, whom he lived with, and basically tell him to knock it off, again. And so they did. And that very night, my parents received a phone call from this guy's parents, who apologized profusely and explained their son was a little socially off and never meant to hurt or scare anyone. They basically said that they told him to leave my mom alone, or they would get the police involved themselves. And in true, naive, small-town fashion, everyone just sort of shook hands and let it go. For a year, maybe more, there were no more sightings of him, no incidents. My dad knew where he lived now, and occasionally would pass by to see if his car was at his house. I suppose it seemed that the gentle admonishment worked. However, that all changed one summer night in 1987. This part I remember well. It was about 9 p.m. and I was in bed, not yet asleep, and I could hear my parents watching TV in the living room. At some point, I heard my sister leave her room and walk down the hall towards the den. Suddenly, there was commotion and an air of panic. It appeared that my sister was having an asthma attack and was really struggling to breathe. This would be the first of many attacks that had her on an inhaler into adulthood. My dad was running one way, my mom another. I heard the shower come on in an attempt to see if the steam would open up her airways. I remember my mom starting to shout that it wasn't working and to call 911. At this point, I got up and stood in the hallway, watching this unfold. I remember my dad yelling that he had called 911 and that they were on the way. My mom was still in the bathroom, trying to get my sister to breathe steam. I'll never forget what happened next. I walked down the hallway towards the den and the staircase that led to the front door. It was a split-level ranch-type house built into the side of a hill, so you had to walk down a flight to get to the front door. I think I was hoping to find my dad, who was probably in the kitchen where the phone was, as I was starting to panic a bit over the situation. However, he ran past me towards the bathroom where my mom and sister were. Suddenly, at the bottom of the steps, stood a young man staring up at me. The front door opened wide behind him. I yelled to my parents that the police were here, and I heard footsteps come running down the hallway towards me. It had only been maybe 1 minute since my dad had said he called 911. I can recall thinking, even at 6 years old or so, wow, they get here fast. My mom came up behind me and proceeded to let out the most blood-curdling scream I have ever heard. It was the fucking Stalker standing there, looking up at us. I hadn't recognized him, so I was now thoroughly confused as to what was going on. My dad was about 3 seconds behind that scream, and when he got there, my mom screamed, "It's him! It's the fucking guy!" I will never forget the look of utter confusion on my dad's face as he had a daughter in the bathroom starving for air, and his wife suddenly in hysterics over a man standing in his doorway. Like, which fucking thing do you attend to first? Well, this dude took one look at my dad and bolted out the door into the dark. He started to follow, but I think quickly realized that he knew where the guy lived, and since it appeared he had run off, there was no immediate threat. He yelled at my mom to go into the kitchen, and she grabbed me in a state of blind panic and pulled me with her. About 2 minutes later, the cops arrived, and one of them was a guy present a year earlier after the initial encounters. My mom started screaming, "He's out there." He was watching us. The cops were completely confused now as well. This was supposed to be a medical emergency, but suddenly, it was a home invasion. EMTs were quickly behind the cops and gave my sister a few shots of an inhaler, and she was breathing again. But now, all attention was on the stalker, as it was clear that he had to have been spying on my parents through a window, and, in his twisted mind, thought he could save the day. The cops caught up with him running down the road and arrested him. He admitted under questioning that he had been going for drives at night for months now, and watching my mom through the windows from the woods. He didn't really seem to understand what the big deal was. He pled guilty to trespassing and some sort of stalking-related crime and went to jail, though I'm not too sure for how long. I have often thought about going back up there to take a look at what records are available on the case. Nothing seems to exist online. According to my parents, the lack of any threats or actual violence sort of rendered the story not newsworthy. My mom was so freaked out that my dad put in for a transfer, and we were back in Brooklyn by the fall. Although it's taken over 35 years, my mom can now tell the story with a laugh, but I don't think she ever got over that night. We found out from old neighbors years later, in the late 90s, that the guy had been in a group home post-jail and died from a heart attack.